A groom refused to marry single mom at the altar. Suddenly, Mafia boss appeared and proposed to her. The old church bell tolled above, each deep, mournful chime echoing through my chest like the gavel of a judge striking down again and again. Guilty, guilty, guilty. I stood frozen at the altar of Grace Hill Church in Charleston, my hands trembling as they clutched a small bouquet of white roses whose scent no longer held sweetness but something heavy with regret. The borrowed wedding dress clung tightly around my chest, making each breath feel like a struggle, while the whispers behind me grew clearer with every passing second. Brian still had not arrived. "He is not coming," my sister Laura whispered, her warm hand resting gently on my bare shoulder, her voice shaking with sorrow. I kept my eyes fixed on the far end of the church aisle, pretending to believe that maybe he was just caught in traffic, or had lost track of time, or was still on his way. But deep down, I already knew the truth. I had read the message I had tried to erase from memory. "I can't do this, Olivia. I'm not ready to raise another man's child." My heart dropped like a stone into the pit of my stomach. Emily, my 6-year-old daughter, was twirling in her little flowered dress, completely unaware of the storm gathering around her mother. More than 80 guests sat in the pews, most of them Brian's relatives. They shifted in their seats, whispering, avoiding my gaze as though the shame rising in this church might cling to them too. The minister checked his watch, then looked at me with an expression of pity I could no longer bear. Each second passed like a fresh cut to the last shred of pride I had left. I heard the rustle of my dress as I shifted, and the petals from my roses began to fall, one by one. Laura leaned in and whispered, "Maybe call him again, Liv." But I only shook my head. I had already called him 17 times. Not once had he answered. The old church door creaked open suddenly, the sound echoing through the space like a warning. My head snapped up, heart pounding. Everyone turned to look. For a moment, I let myself believe in a miracle, that Brian had finally come. But it was not him. The man who stepped through the doorway was tall, moving with a slow, deliberate grace. His eyes were like cold steel, sweeping the room with such quiet authority that all the whispers ceased at once. He wore a charcoal gray suit, immaculately tailored, and a glimpse of a costly watch gleamed at his wrist. His dark hair was neatly combed, and his face was chiseled, as though carved from marble. He was not handsome in any warm or gentle way, but carried the striking presence of a storm not yet broken, a predator hiding its claws. I had never seen this man before, yet something in his gaze stirred a strange mix of recognition and unease in me. "Who is that?" Laura murmured. I said nothing. The man moved down the aisle, footsteps echoing over the old stone floor. His eyes never left mine, deep and unreadable, holding me captive where I stood. The air inside the church felt thick, my heartbeat thundering in my ears. When he stopped, only a few steps away, his cologne filled the space between us, sharp and expensive, layered with a strong note of wood and something darker. He spoke in a voice low and steady, with the faint lilt of Eastern Europe in his accent. "Olivia Harper." I nodded, my chest tightening. "I am Damien Rourke." The name meant nothing to me, yet the way he said it felt weighty, like a verdict already decided. I tried to stay composed, my fingers gripping the wilting bouquet. His eyes flicked to the empty altar, then back to me. "Where is your groom?" I swallowed hard, willing my voice not to shake. He isn't coming." Damien nodded once, his lips pressed into a firm line. "I know. Brian Maddox owes me a great deal, and he disappeared this morning." A murmur rose among the guests. I took a step back, stunned. "I don't understand," I said, my voice catching. "What are you talking about?" He looked directly into my eyes, and there was something both cold and sad in his expression. "You will, soon enough. He didn't just leave you behind. He left his debt to me as well. And now," he paused, lowering his voice, "you are the only one left to pay the price." Those words rang out like the church bells themselves, each one striking against my ribs, hollow and inescapable. Before we continue with the next part of the story, if you've felt a spark of empathy, or if your heart has stirred even slightly, take just a moment to subscribe to the YouTube channel Dear Single Mom. Click like and share this video with someone you believe might also need a story to help reflect on their own journey. Every single subscription, every comment from you, is what keeps us going, inspiring us to tell more stories that are real, moving, and deeply human each and every day. Where are you watching this video from? Leave us a comment below and let us know how far Olivia's story has traveled across America or perhaps even beyond its borders. And now, let's continue with part 2 of the story. I stood there, the sound of Damien's voice filling the sacred stillness of the church, each word he spoke striking the calm inside me like stones flung into water that had once been still. Brian owed money, had vanished, and I was the one left behind to carry the weight of it all. I looked around, hoping someone would rise to challenge what had just been said, but no one did. Every person I had ever known, friends, co-workers, relatives, even the minister remained frozen in place, silent as statues. I felt like a character in a play for which I'd never seen the script. Damien looked at me with an unwavering gaze. There was something in the way he stood, the way he spoke, that made it impossible not to listen. I tried to find my breath, tried to gather my voice. "I have nothing to do with his debt," I said, my voice small but steady. "I'm just the one he left behind." Damien nodded, almost in agreement. "You are the victim, but unfortunately, you are also the only thing he left behind, and I never let anyone walk out of my life without leaving something behind." I began to tremble, not because he raised his voice or threatened me, but because of the absolute calm in his tone. It was cold, precise, and left no space for negotiation. Laura gently tugged at my arm, as if to shield me, but I didn't move. I don't know why I didn't run. Maybe the humiliation was too large, too crushing, and I was paralyzed beneath it. Maybe I knew that even if I ran, there was nowhere left to go. I remembered the message. The one I had opened this very morning but hadn't found the courage to read all the way through. A message from Brian, the man I had trusted, the one I had allowed into my life, into my daughter's life. It was only a few lines, but it had shattered me completely. He couldn't marry me. He couldn't raise Emily. He didn't want to be the father of a child who wasn't his own. When had my daughter, Emily, become a name people turned away from? When had the hopes I had so carefully nurtured become a burden to someone else? I lowered my head, Damien's words echoing through my mind, merging with the ache that Brian had left behind. It felt as if someone had torn away every year I had spent preserving my pride, every night I had curled around my daughter in our damp little apartment, every dollar I had saved from my part-time job as a nurse. All of it vanished in a single afternoon. I had thought I had found a way out. I had thought this time it was real. But no, I had been wrong. Again. Emily sat in the front pew, her small legs swinging, playing with the edge of the white veil with the innocent joy only a child could summon. She turned to me and smiled, blissfully unaware that the dream of a complete family had just collapsed right in front of her. Children have a strange way of living in their own world, where everything is still simple and sweet. I didn't want to break that world. Not yet. Not now. Damien reached into the pocket of his coat and pulled out a folded envelope. "He left this for you," he said, handing it to me. I opened it and found a few hastily scribbled lines on hotel stationery. Brian's handwriting was unmistakable, rushed, tinged with guilt, but above all, filled with cowardice. "Olivia, I'm sorry. I can't do this. You and your daughter deserve better than me. I tried, but I can't shake this feeling. I hope one day you'll understand." I folded the letter shut. I understood, all too well. Damien said nothing more. He just watched me, as if waiting for something. A reaction, a decision, maybe even a single sob. But I didn't cry. I couldn't. Something inside me had already frozen over. I lifted my head and looked straight at him. I wanted to ask why he was here, how he knew everything, why he looked at me like I was a wounded creature he had both rescued and claimed. But before I could speak, Damien continued, his voice low, as if it were the final bell tolling in a long, echoing silence. "I didn't come here to threaten you, Olivia. I came with an offer you don't have to answer right now, but you do have to hear it." I held my breath. "I will erase Brian's debt. In return, you will marry me, right here, right now." I heard the bouquet fall from my hands, the white roses scattered onto the cold stone floor, and in that moment, I realized the world I once knew had changed completely. I stood frozen, as if turned to stone, my eyes locked on the man who had just spoken a proposal no one could have imagined. Marry him, right here, right now. Damien Rourke, a name I had only heard for the first time less than 5 minutes ago, now stood at the center of the aisle where I had just been abandoned, offering marriage as if it were a business deal laid out in neat, cold terms. The wedding guests began to stir, soft whispers turning into small waves rippling through the old church. I heard scattered words drift from the crowd, murmurs of mafia, debt, fraud, and quiet judgments, sharp enough to sting the skin. Laura moved closer, pulling me gently a few steps back. She whispered harshly, her voice tight with fear, "Olivia, you can't be serious. You can't marry a stranger, especially not someone like him." I wanted to nod, to tell her I felt the same madness pressing down on me. But my throat tightened. Damien did not retract a single word. He stood there, calm and unyielding, not like a man proposing love, but like someone offering a lifeline bound in hard choices. I drew in a deep breath, my thoughts tangled in chaos. Everything inside me clashed. Logic screamed that this was a mistake, that I didn't know who this man truly was, that he might be dangerous, capable of ruining everything I had left. But my heart, the part of me that had grown tired of being left behind, tired of watching my daughter grow up without a father, whispered something quieter. Maybe this was a way out, or at least something that made me feel like I wasn't completely worthless. I glanced at Emily. She still sat in the front pew, her curious eyes fixed on Damien. She didn't understand what was happening, but I knew that in her mind, she was hoping for a miracle. A man had walked in, dressed in a fine suit, as if out of a fairy tale, and instead of walking away like the others before him, he asked to marry her mother. That might be the closest thing to magic she had ever seen. I turned to face Damien again. He said nothing more. He didn't push. He didn't explain. He simply waited for me to decide. I had grown used to choosing between bad and worse. But this time felt different. This time, I felt as though I was standing at the edge of a door opening into a world I didn't know, but one that wasn't the place I had just been left in. I asked, almost in a whisper, "Why me?" Damien didn't move. His voice was even, neither warm nor cold. "Because you are the only one left. Because I need a wife to close a few chapters. Because I know you have nothing left to lose. And because you're the only one who might understand what a second chance is truly worth." I don't know why his answer cracked something open in me. Maybe because he wasn't pretending to love me, wasn't painting some beautiful dream. He gave me the truth, bare and sharp. And in some strange way, that clarity felt safer than all the sweet promises Brian had ever spoken. I swallowed hard, my voice a rasp. "If I say yes, what happens then?" Damien stepped forward, his tone dropping just low enough for only me to hear. "You become my wife. Legally. I erase his debt. I ensure you and your daughter are protected completely. I won't touch you unless you want me to. And if, after 6 months, you decide this can't continue, I will sign the divorce papers. No strings." I almost laughed. A marriage written like a contract, but what in my life hadn't been bargained for, one way or another? I gave a small nod, just enough to shift something in his eyes. He reached out his hand, steady and strong. I placed mine in his. My fingers were cold. His hand was warm and solid as stone, but when he tightened his grip, I felt as if I'd been pulled from a deep, dark pit. The minister stepped forward, uncertainty clouding his eyes as he looked at me, then at Damien. "Is this truly a ceremony of marriage?" Damien answered without delay. "Yes. Legal. No coercion. She consents." I nodded. Laura sobbed behind me. A few guests quietly rose from their seats and walked out, but I stood firm. I had fallen too many times to care what anyone else thought anymore. The minister began to speak the vows, his voice trembling, but he did not stop. Damien and I faced each other. There was no love, no rings, no kiss, only an agreement, and a beginning unlike anything I had ever imagined. When the minister declared us husband and wife, Damien did not smile, but in his eyes I saw something flicker, not affection, but certainty. And in that moment, I knew I had stepped into a completely different world. A world where I was no longer the woman who had been left behind. I was now the wife of Damien Rourke, and my life had taken a turn from which there was no return. I don't remember the exact words of the minister's vows, nor do I recall what I repeated after him. All I know is that each sentence passed through me as though I were standing outside my own body, watching from some distant place where none of this could possibly be real. Everything happened too fast, too strange, too silent, until I could no longer tell if it was truly happening or just another fever dream of the heart. The man I had met only moments before stood beside me, neither smiling nor faltering, showing no sign of hesitation. Damien Rourke looked like a sculpture carved from stone, cold and unwavering, and yet something in his eyes made it impossible for me to walk away. When the ceremony ended, there were no claps, no cheers, no congratulations. Most of the guests had already slipped out. The rest remained only to watch, as if witnessing a quiet disaster they couldn't look away from. I turned to Laura. She was still there, her face pale and stunned, her eyes swollen with held-back tears. Emily came running to me, looked up with wide, wondering eyes, and asked in her innocent voice, "Did you really marry him, Mommy?" I sank to my knees and pulled her into my arms. "Yes, sweetheart. I just got married." She tilted her head toward Damien, then giggled. "He's the handsomest groom I've ever seen." Damien didn't smile, but he nodded once, and for the briefest second, something flickered in his eyes, something almost gentle. After everyone had gone, I was led out to the black car waiting just outside the church steps. Damien opened the door for me and Emily. The gesture was so unexpectedly polite, so precise, it left me more shaken than reassured. As the car pulled away from the stone steps of Grace Hill, I finally began to feel the tremble inside me. I had just entered into an agreement without a contract, without an attorney, without even a moment to think. Just a promise. But it was the promise of a man who clearly wasn't to be taken lightly. The air inside the car was unnaturally still. Emily sat between us, absorbed with a toy she had found in a small wedding gift bag someone must have handed her before leaving. I stared out the window as the quiet streets of Charleston blurred past like pieces of an old film, flickering in slow motion. Finally, I turned to Damien, my voice steadier than I expected. "So, what does this mean to you?" He leaned back in the seat, one hand resting lightly on his knee, eyes fixed ahead. "It means you are my wife, on paper and in the eyes of those who are watching me, and that will keep you and your daughter safe." I tightened my hands in my lap. "So this is a transaction, a contract?" He nodded. "Precisely. You can think of it that way. 6 months. After that, if you want to walk away, I won't stop you. You'll be given enough to start over." I looked at him, my heart a tangle of emotions I couldn't untie. I should have felt insulted, should have felt like I was being traded, bartered. But strangely, I didn't. What I felt was that, for the first time in a long time, I had been chosen. I had been seen. I was no longer the one left behind. Damien turned to me, his voice deeper now. "But there's one condition. During these 6 months, you and Emily stay with me. No disappearing, no wandering. I need to ensure your safety. And I don't tolerate betrayal." I nodded. I didn't have the strength to argue. There was nothing left to lose. A few minutes later, the car turned onto the highway and picked up speed. Damien handed me a new phone, instructing me to throw out the old SIM card and wipe the device clean. I followed his directions without question, moving like someone under a spell. Part of me understood I had entered a world where everything was monitored, controlled, but the other part of me, the part that had lived too long with chaos, found a strange comfort in that control. As the sun began to set, casting the sky in deep hues of amber and blood red, the car kept moving down an unfamiliar road, carrying me away from the place I once thought might be the beginning of a new life. But that beginning had shattered. And now, a new one waited just ahead. There was no white wedding dress, no music, no tender glances exchanged across candlelit vows. There was only a stranger, a promise of safety, and a deal I could not afford to turn away from. A deal at the altar. A bargain struck between two people who did not know love, but who understood, all too well, the price of loneliness. And from that place, a new story began. The sunset cast a golden wash across the sky ahead of the windshield, stretching like a road of fire leading straight into a place I had never known. The SUV glided smoothly along the highway, as silent as the thoughts unraveling inside me. Emily had fallen asleep in her seat, her head resting gently on my shoulder, her breathing soft and even, untouched by the storm that had just torn through our lives. Damien sat across from us, the last light of day brushing across his cheekbones, sharpening the hard lines of his face until he looked as if he'd been carved from granite. I didn't know how long I'd gone without speaking. The silence in the car wasn't tense, but it wasn't comforting either. It was like the pause between two storms. I turned the new phone in my hand. No contacts, no photos, no history. A different life, wiped clean and cold to the touch. I spoke, trying to keep my voice steady. "Where are you taking me and my daughter?" Damien didn't look at me, but he answered without pause. "Nashville. A property of mine on the southern outskirts. Isolated, quiet, safe." I blinked. I wasn't sure if it was from surprise, or from the sudden realization that everything was slipping beyond my control. I hadn't expected to go that far. I thought this was just an act, a cover to fool an enemy or someone watching him. But he truly intended for me to live with him. 6 months, he had said that, and I had nodded. "You could have refused when I made the offer," he said, this time turning to meet my eyes. I met his gaze, refusing to look away. I didn't know what I was choosing. I only knew that in that moment, there was nowhere else to go. He nodded slowly, as if he understood more than I could say. I don't expect you to love me, Olivia. I don't expect you to trust me. I only expect you to keep the agreement. Your safety and Emily's depend on that. I turned to look at my daughter. For 6 years, I hadn't let anyone get close enough to disrupt what the two of us had built. And now, I had let a stranger take my child away from the only place she knew as home. All of it had happened in less than a day. I didn't know if I was a brave mother or a desperate fool. Streetlights began to appear, scattered along the roadside as the car veered off the highway and into a long stretch of road that wound through thick woods. No more traffic, no more signs. Only the encroaching night. I asked, almost reflexively, "Damien, who are you really?" He didn't respond right away. Silence filled the car for a few beats before he answered, slowly. "I'm the man Brian stole a great deal of money from. And you, Olivia, even if it's only through an agreement, are now my wife. That means you've stepped into a part of my world that I rarely let anyone touch. I won't lie to you. I'm not a good man. I do what I must to survive, but I don't betray what's mine." The words sounded like a warning, but somewhere deep inside me, they sparked something else. Maybe it was a strange sense of safety. Maybe it was the quiet dread of losing control. The car turned through a large wrought iron gate, flanked by towering trees that shielded everything behind them. Beyond lay a stone-paved driveway leading to a large house, almost entirely removed from the outside world. Warm yellow light glowed through the windows, soft and almost implausibly inviting. I tightened my grip on Emily's hand, feeling my pulse thudding beneath cold skin. When the car stopped, a man in black stepped out and opened the door. Damien gestured for me to exit first. I stepped out, my legs trembling from the weight of the day. Damien didn't touch me. He simply walked ahead, holding the door open for Emily and me to enter. Inside, the house was warmer than I had imagined. The scent of pine wood, the hush of controlled silence, and the soft lighting wrapped the space in a kind of careful calm. This was the destination of a journey I had never planned. The place where I would live for the next 6 months as the wife of a man I barely knew. A journey without a map, a life with no path to return to. And now, all I could do was keep walking forward, without once looking back. The heavy wooden door closed behind me, its echo rolling through the grand hall like the sound of something final. The first mark of a life I could no longer predict. I stood still, my fingers wrapped tightly around Emily's small hand, my eyes tracing the vastness of the house now bathed in a soft, quiet light that seemed to erase the sense of passing time. The walls were painted in muted tones, the floors a deep polished brown, the ceilings high and crowned with chandeliers that glimmered like frozen rain. Everything in that house spoke of refinement and order, the kind of beauty that had been lived in but never truly warmed by human presence. Damien said nothing. He gave a brief nod to a woman who had appeared from the right hallway, dressed in a gray uniform. She looked to be in her early 40s, her face kind though momentarily startled when she saw me and Emily. The expression vanished quickly, replaced by professional calm. "This is Mrs. Grant, the housekeeper," Damien said without glancing at me. "She'll take you and Emily to your rooms. I'll see you at breakfast." And with that, he turned toward the curved wooden staircase and disappeared without waiting for my reply. I was left standing there, unsure of whether to call after him or simply breathe. Mrs. Grant smiled faintly and motioned for us to follow. The hallway she led us through was long, lined with tall glass windows that opened to a garden bathed in moonlight. Outside, the still surface of a pond mirrored the silver sky. Each of our footsteps echoed softly, the sound folding into the silence like a memory I wasn't sure was mine. The room prepared for Emily and me was at the end of the upstairs corridor. When Mrs. Grant opened the door, I caught my breath. It wasn't a simple bedroom. It was a space carefully divided into 2 worlds. One side held a large bed covered in crisp white sheets, polished nightstands with matching lamps, and the faint scent of new linen. The other side held a smaller bed, neatly made, a plush bear perched on the pillow, a low bookshelf filled with picture books, and a child's desk by the window draped with pale pink curtains. Everything was immaculate, untouched, as if it had been waiting. Emily squealed with delight and ran across the room, bouncing onto her bed and hugging the bear to her chest as if she'd known it forever. I couldn't move. Mrs. Grant spoke gently, as though afraid to disturb the fragile quiet inside me. "If you need anything, there's a call button beside the bed. Someone will bring you down for breakfast at 7. Good night, Mrs. Harper." The door closed softly behind her, and I sat down on the edge of the bed, my hands cold, my chest hollow. It had all happened too quickly. That morning, I had stood in a wedding dress waiting for a man who never came. By afternoon, I had become the wife of a stranger. And now, I was in a house with no name, no memories, no familiar scent. Yet it had everything I'd never dared to hope for. A clean, quiet room. A warm place where Emily could sleep without the sound of arguments seeping through paper-thin walls, without sirens wailing through the night. I walked to the window. Outside, the garden shimmered under the moonlight, still and hauntingly serene. No street noise, no voices, only the wind whispering through tall trees that encircled the estate like sentinels. The isolation was complete, beautiful, and unsettling. I wondered how many lives had passed through this house before mine, how many stories had been locked within its silent walls, how many secrets slept beneath its polished floors. And now I, Olivia Harper, was part of it, not as a guest, but as someone bound to it by a title that still felt foreign on my tongue. Wife, the wife of Damien Rourke. I turned toward Emily. She was already asleep, curled around her bear, her small face peaceful, untouched by the storm that had rewritten our world in a single day. Watching her, I understood that the dream had already begun, and from this moment forward, there was no waking from it. I woke that morning with the strange sensation that I had awakened somewhere outside of reality. A faint light slipped through the heavy curtains, falling across the polished wood floor in soft golden lines that felt unfamiliar. Emily was still asleep in the small bed beside mine, her arms wrapped around a stuffed bear I had never seen before. I rose quietly, my feet sinking into the thick carpet without a sound. The bathroom gleamed, its bottles neatly arranged, the towels white as snow, the water warm and perfectly drawn. Everything in this house was too precise, too composed, as if my life no longer belonged to me but had been organized by unseen hands. At exactly 7, there was a knock at the door. A young woman appeared, perhaps in her early 20s, polite smile fixed on her face, though her eyes betrayed a hint of caution. She didn't offer a name, she simply said I was invited to breakfast. Emily was still deep in sleep, so I let her rest and followed the woman down wide, echoing hallways that smelled faintly of pine wood and something much older, like time itself. The dining room lay at the back of the house, its ceiling high, a wall of glass opening to the garden beyond. Damien was already seated, one hand around a cup of coffee, the other turning the pages of a newspaper with deliberate calm, as though this were any ordinary morning. I hesitated a moment in the doorway. He didn't look up, yet he knew I was there. Sit down. I crossed the room, my hand brushing against the cold wooden chair before I sat. My eyes drifted across the space, half expecting to find something that might prove this was just a retreat, a temporary refuge, a strange dream. But there was nothing of the sort. This was real. A servant brought breakfast and coffee, eggs, toast, and fruit laid out in neat arrangement. I didn't touch the food. I drank a small sip of water and waited. Damien folded his newspaper and met my gaze. I need to set a few rules. His voice was even, unhurried, not threatening, but it carried no trace of invitation. This was not a negotiation. I nodded, keeping my expression calm. For the next 6 months, you'll live here with your daughter. You are not to leave the property without my consent. All outside communication goes through the phone I've given you. I've cut every line that could lead anyone back to you. I frowned. He spoke as though I were a protected witness in some hidden case. I was just a woman left at the altar, not a criminal. But I said nothing. He continued, your daughter will be homeschooled. I've hired a tutor who will start next week. Your room has an electronic lock, but it isn't restrictive. However, the main entrance is always monitored. No one from outside enters this house without my approval. My voice came out rough. What about my friends? My family? Damien looked at me as if I had asked something naive. If you want them safe, don't contact them. Brian didn't just owe me money. He was involved with people I can't allow anywhere near you or your daughter. You have no idea what he pulled you into. I froze. Until that moment, I had thought this was merely an arrangement between two adults, but now it felt different. I wasn't a wife in a strange marriage. I was a hostage in a golden fortress. Damien drank his coffee slowly. I'm not doing this to control you. I'm doing it to protect you. If you don't trust me, then trust your instincts. You chose this marriage. I didn't force you. I nodded. He was right. I had chosen. In the worst moment of my life, I had said yes to this man, believing I was reaching for safety. What I hadn't realized was how quickly every door behind me would close. Damien stood. I have to go. I'll be away for a few days. Mrs. Grant will handle everything while I'm gone. If there's an emergency, call me. He stepped closer, his eyes lingering on mine for a moment longer than before. Olivia, remember this. You are not a prisoner. But if you try to run, I won't come after you. I'll come after Emily. And I won't be gentle. I held his gaze. swallowing the surge of anger that burned at the back of my throat. When he left, the room seemed to grow colder. I turned toward the garden beyond the glass, the trees swaying softly in the morning wind. I had thought I was entering a marriage to find peace, but the truth was, I was living in a house built on conditions, a place where freedom was only a borrowed word, and I was the bride held fast by a promise with no way out. After Damien left the estate, something in the air shifted lighter, perhaps, but no less taut. I spent the morning rearranging the room, not because it was messy, but because I needed something to keep my hands busy, something to hold back the thoughts that kept circling his words from breakfast. 6 months of being watched, no contact, no freedom to leave. That was the price of safety, or at least, the cost of a mistake I hadn't made. But in the swirl of unease, Emily was like a strange and perfect fragment of light. She woke later than usual, rubbing her eyes, and suddenly lit up as she took in the room. "Mommy, is this our new house?" I nodded, trying to smile. Just for a while. She bounced out of bed, barefoot on the carpet, opening drawers and closets, pulling at handles until she found a box of new crayons and a few picture books already waiting on her desk. She sat down immediately, flipping through the pages with eyes that sparkled. Not a single question about Brian. Not a word about the broken wedding or the church or why we were here. Children have their own way of adapting, sometimes faster than we do. For Emily, having me nearby, a soft bed, a few new toys, and the absence of being scolded for spilling a cup of water was enough to feel safe. At noon, Mrs. Grant brought up a tray of simple food. She was used to silence, used to distance, and didn't press with questions. But the way her eyes softened when they rested on Emily said, "Enough." She told me a teacher would be arriving tomorrow to begin Emily's schooling, a woman who had been carefully screened. I nodded. I didn't have a choice. Still, somewhere inside me, something stirred. I didn't want my daughter to be educated behind walls, inside a fortress with no classmates, no playground, no laughter of children echoing in the background. But I also knew here, at least for now, she was safe. That afternoon, I took Emily to explore the grounds behind the house. The back garden was bigger than I'd imagined, dotted with old trees, winding stone paths, and a wooden swing that hung low beneath the largest tree. Emily squealed when she saw it, ran ahead, and climbed on, swaying as if this had always belonged to her. I stood back, hands tucked into the pockets of a thin coat, letting the wind move through my hair, the late sunlight easing the lines at the corners of my eyes. Emily looked back at me. "Mommy, I like this place. Can we stay a long time?" I gave a faint smile. "We'll stay for a while." She nodded and kept swinging, hair flying across her face, and watching her like that, I couldn't help but wonder if I was doing the right thing. I had brought her into a world I didn't understand, a place where every hallway might carry a secret behind its doors. But if I had stayed in Charleston, if I'd kept chasing a future built with men like Brian, would it have been any better? Here, at least, she had a swing. She had crayons. She had sleep, uninterrupted. That night, I read her a fairy tale, my voice hoarse with exhaustion. She fell asleep halfway through, her breathing slow and even. I turned off the light and stayed sitting at the edge of her bed, watching her face in the dark. Sometimes, surviving isn't about keeping yourself intact, it's about keeping the ones you love from breaking. Even if it costs your freedom, even if it means solitude, even if it asks for things you can't yet name. This house, this life, these rules, they were unfamiliar and uneasy, but if Emily smiled, if she could grow up wrapped in something close to peace, then I could stay. As long as she could laugh, as long as she could rest, I would endure anything. And in that first night, when the silence was so complete I could hear the beating of my own heart, I understood something deeply. Emily's new world had begun, and for me, it was a trade. But it was a trade I would never regret. Damien returned late in the afternoon on the third day. I heard the sound of tires crunching softly across the stone driveway, and minutes later, the heavy wooden door opened. No announcement, no greeting, but the atmosphere in the house shifted the moment he stepped inside. The silence, already deep, became taut, stretched thin, like the last note of a song that refuses to fade. I was in the library, a quiet room tucked off the left corridor, where I'd begun to spend more and more time reading, or pretending to, just to keep my thoughts from unraveling. Emily was studying with her tutor in the room next door. As I rose, unsure whether to stay or leave, Damien entered. Same dark suit, same composed face. But something in his walk, in the weariness gathered at the edges of his eyes, gave me pause. He nodded once, in place of a greeting. I thought he would dive straight into something cold and calculated, some rule or update that would reset the delicate balance of this place. But instead, he moved toward one of the shelves, pulled out a hardcover book, and began flipping through its pages. I watched him, uncertain if I should speak. At last, I said, quietly, carefully, "Was the trip all right?" He closed the book gently, still not looking at me. "There are a few things left to deal with." I nodded, started to turn away, but then his voice caught me. "Is Emily doing well?" Of all the things I thought he might say, that was the last. I looked at him, longer than I normally allowed myself. "She's fine. Actually, she likes it here." He nodded, his eyes still on the spine of the book in his hand. "I appreciate what you've done for her," I said. He finally looked up, meeting my gaze. "I don't do anything halfway. If I promise to protect someone, I see it through." In his eyes, I caught something fleeting. Regret, perhaps, or exhaustion. "I don't know much about you, Olivia," he went on. "But I know what it feels like to be betrayed. I know what it's like when your world tips on its axis. When you don't trust anyone, especially men like me." I didn't move, but I felt something inside shift, like a wall long fortified beginning to crack. "I don't know much about you either," I replied softly. "Except you always wear a suit, never smile, and like to control everything." And then, to my surprise, he laughed. A short, real laugh. It was the first time I saw him break. The first time he didn't feel untouchable or sharp-edged. For a breath of a moment, he was just a man. Damien Rourke. A man raised in a family no one spoke about, taught to survive long before he was ever taught to love. A man who could run a network of power with ruthless precision, but had no answer when a little girl asked why he didn't have a pet. I didn't know what had made him the way he was, but in that moment, I didn't see a criminal or a cold strategist. I saw someone who had lost something long ago, and was now trying to protect what little he had left. He stepped closer. "Olivia, I'm not an easy man to live with. I have rules, enemies, and parts of my life I'll never let you touch. But I won't hurt you, and I won't let anyone else hurt you either." I nodded, this time not out of fear but because I believed him. At least in that. This house was still a maze, every door a question I wasn't ready to answer. But as I stood there, looking at the man before me, for the first time I didn't feel entirely alone. He wasn't a good man, but maybe, just maybe, he was learning how to be something better. And I, the woman once left at the altar, might be the only one who could see the man behind the suit wasn't made of steel and silence, but of loneliness wrapped too tightly around old scars. A man who had never known how to love, but maybe, one day, could learn if someone was willing to stay long enough to teach him. Damien was no longer just a shadow that drifted through this house of secrets. Since that quiet conversation in the library, his presence had taken on a new weight, not loud, not demanding, but unmistakably real. He appeared at meals, always seated at the head of the long dining table, silent yet attentive, his eyes discreetly observing, never wandering. He didn't speak much, but when he did, there was clarity in his words, and lately, those words were often directed toward Emily, not out of politeness, but genuine curiosity. And strangely, Emily wasn't afraid of him. In fact, she seemed drawn to his stillness, to that quiet control he carried like a second skin, perhaps sensing in him something she hadn't yet learned to name, something that filled a space she didn't even know was empty. I was slower to soften. Everything Damien said, every gesture he made, I measured, examined, questioned. Not because I wanted to doubt him, but because I had been disappointed too many times to take anything at face value. I knew better than to confuse brief kindness with true character. Trust, to me, had never come wrapped in promises. It was something built slowly, painfully, through all the little things no one ever noticed. One morning, Emily spilled a glass of orange juice on the living room rug. I had barely risen from my chair to clean it when Damien was already there. He said nothing harsh, no scolding tone. He simply asked Emily to step back, then called for someone to help with the mess. I waited for tension, for irritation. Instead, he knelt beside her, pulled a folded handkerchief from his suit pocket, and gently wiped her hands. Then he looked at me. Children need to make mistakes, not to be punished for them, but to learn how to face what comes next. His voice was calm, but the words rooted themselves deep inside me, deeper than any hollow apology or elaborate vow ever had. Another night, I woke to the sound of footsteps in the hall. I opened the door to see a faint glow coming from the library. I crept down the corridor, about to turn away when I heard the notes of a piano. Hesitant, slightly uneven, but achingly beautiful in its loneliness. I didn't interrupt. I just stood in the shadows and listened. The next morning, I asked Damien if he knew who had been playing. He looked at me for a long moment but gave no answer. He didn't need to. I already knew. There was something in him I hadn't expected. A man who commanded silence and power, who lived surrounded by control and shadow, yet let himself drift into music when no one was watching. That wasn't the act of a man hardened beyond feeling. That was someone who still carried something fragile inside. Still, I kept my distance, not out of rejection, but protection. Not for him, but for me. I didn't want to misplace trust again. Damien never pushed, never pried. He let me navigate the world he had pulled me into on my own terms. But every time I faltered, he was there, never hovering, just present, steady, solid. Enough to remind me that even here, in a life I hadn't chosen, I wasn't entirely alone. Once, I asked him why he had chosen me, of all the ways he could have covered Brian's debt. His answer was simple. Because you were the only one who looked me in the eye when everyone else turned away. That stayed with me. For years, I had lived knowing that people only looked at me when they wanted something. But this time, I had been chosen simply for standing my ground. Not for what I had, not for what I lacked, but for the fact that I hadn't looked away. Damien never said he loved me. He never offered sweet words or made impossible promises. But the way he quietly arranged things for Emily, the way his eyes softened across the breakfast table, the way he let silence speak without needing to fill it, those were gestures that spoke louder than declarations ever could. It wasn't love. Not yet. But perhaps it was trust. And somehow, I had begun to give that back, not in words, but in how I no longer flinched when he entered a room, in how I let Emily call him uncle without correction, in how, one early morning, I poured him a cup of coffee before he even asked. For me, trust never came wrapped in flowers or carved into promises. It came quietly, through the repetition of small, thoughtful things, and I knew, as I watched him from across the room, that I had started to build something I never meant to. Not love. Not yet. But the foundation of everything that might come after. Trust. The one thing that cannot be given freely. Only earned, piece by piece. That morning, the sky was the color of iron. Thick clouds pressed low and heavy, turning the air dense before noon even arrived. Damien had left early, saying nothing about where he was going. Only a brief message relayed through Mrs. Grant. He would be back late. Emily and I spent most of the morning in the back garden, where she had now memorized every flower bed, every winding path. But despite the quiet, something restless stirred in me. A strange, unsettled feeling clung to the edges of my mind, like mist that wouldn't lift. I'd lived enough years with fear to know when something wasn't right. And that morning, something wasn't. By mid-afternoon, Emily and I were coloring in the living room when I heard the sound of tires on gravel fast, loud, jarring against the usual stillness of this place. It wasn't Damien's car. This one growled as it tore up the drive, reckless and wrong. I stood at once, pulling Emily behind the door. Through the curtain, I saw a black SUV skid to a stop at the base of the steps. The door flew open and 3 men stepped out. They wore plain clothes, but something in their posture, the way they moved, the way they scanned the house like it was theirs to take, froze the blood in my veins. One of them was tall, built like a wall, with a jagged scar running from the edge of his ear down his neck. His face was hard and unreadable, but his eyes swept the windows as if searching for something, or someone. Mrs. Grant appeared behind me, her voice low but firm. "Take Emily upstairs. Lock the door. Don't come out until I say." I didn't question her. I just scooped Emily up and ran. We climbed the stairs quickly, my heart pounding as I locked the door behind us. Emily clutched my hand, sensing the tension though I hadn't spoken a word. "What's wrong, Mommy?" she whispered. I brushed her hair back, forcing calm into my voice. "Nothing, sweetie. Just visitors. Probably came at the wrong time. But I knew better. No one visited this house uninvited. No one got past the gates without permission." I pressed my ear to the door, listening. Voices floated up from below, not shouting, but sharp and heated. Mrs. Grant's tone, usually so soft, now carried the edge of warning. Then, silence. A silence too sudden, too complete. I picked up my phone, stared at it for a moment, then typed a short message to Damien. ***, strangers just came to the house. Mrs. Grant told us to stay inside. Are you okay? ***. The message sent. But there was no reply. Minutes passed. Then a knock, soft, measured. I opened the door a sliver. Mrs. Grant stood there, her expression composed but pale. "They're gone," she said. But they didn't leave quietly. I stepped out, my voice tight. Who were they? She hesitated. Men from Mr. Rourke's past. People he thought he had dealt with. Apparently, not completely. They didn't come for you, Olivia. They came to leave a message for him. I tightened my grip on the doorknob. Are we safe? She met my eyes and answered slowly. For now. But you need to understand, life here isn't like the one you knew. There are shadows that never knock first. When she left, I sat on the bed and pulled Emily into my arms, conflicted in every possible way. For days now, I'd started to trust Damien. I'd started to believe this strange, controlled life could somehow settle into something almost normal. But the sudden arrival of those men, their eyes, their silence reminded me that none of this was normal. And safety, in this house, was always conditional. As night fell, I still hadn't heard from Damien. No text, no call, nothing. And I knew the storm was closer now than ever before. A threat had stepped out of the shadows, no longer content to linger at the edge. It had come to the front door, to remind me that peace here was never permanent, that Damien wasn't just fighting for his past anymore. He was fighting for the fragile future he had created for Emily, and somehow, for me. And that future now trembled with every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of wind beyond the windows. Because the truth was no longer hidden. It had arrived, uninvited, and it knew where to find us. That night, the rain began to fall, not heavy, but steady and relentless, each drop tapping against the window pane like a quiet drumbeat warning of something approaching. Emily had fallen asleep, curled around her teddy bear like always, unaware of the shift in the air. But I couldn't sleep. The message I'd sent to Damien still had no reply. Each time my phone lit up with another notification, my heart jumped, only to sink again into a hollow silence. I left the room, my steps careful along the dim hallway, and made my way downstairs to the kitchen. A single warm light glowed from the small lamp by the counter, casting long shadows across the walls. The quiet in the house wasn't peace, it was breathless. I poured a glass of water, drinking slowly, trying to calm the restless thudding in my chest. Then I heard it. Not loud, just the soft sound of something brushing wood against plaster, maybe a shoe against wet ground. Not the usual creaks of an old house in the wind. Something else. I froze, back pressed to the wall, listening. Again, the sound metal clicking faintly, like tools or weapons. I turned and moved fast, climbing the stairs, heartbeat loud in my ears. But when I passed the small study near the stairwell, I noticed the door slightly ajar. The desk lamp was on. I knew I had seen that room in darkness earlier. Someone had been inside. I didn't stop to think. I ran straight back to the bedroom, locked the door, and went into Emily's room. She was still asleep, peaceful in the silence that now felt like a trap. I opened the nightstand drawer, where Damien had once left a small knife, not with a speech, not with warning, just placed there as if to say, "This is the kind of world you've entered." I hadn't known then if it was meant as protection or a warning, but tonight, I knew exactly what it was. My hand trembled slightly as I gripped the handle. But my mind was clear. I sat by the door, every sense awake, every sound amplified. I could hear footsteps slow, deliberate, not the sound of someone moving comfortably in their own home, but of someone who didn't belong here. Fear didn't turn to panic. It turned into focus. I thought of Emily. I thought of her face in sleep, of the peace I had tried to preserve in this place built on shadows. And I knew I wouldn't let anyone steal that from her. A knock. Soft, then the rattle of the doorknob. I gripped the knife tighter, heart pounding, stepping in front of the bed as if my body alone could block the dark. The door was locked. It didn't open. Whoever was out there stayed for a moment, then slowly walked away. I didn't move for the rest of the night. I sat there until dawn broke, until light spilled through the edge of the curtain and reminded me I had made it through. Emily stirred, rubbed her eyes, and looked at me. "Mommy, were you up all night?" I nodded, forcing a tired smile. "Just keeping an eye on the rain." At 8, Mrs. Grant knocked. Her face was different this morning, drawn, pale, and uncharacteristically still. "There are unfamiliar footprints by the back door," she said quietly. "The alarm system was disabled, temporarily. Someone was inside." I felt my stomach turn. "They didn't take anything. They didn't touch anything," she continued. "Maybe it was just a message," but I shook my head. "They didn't come to send a message. They came for us. And if I hadn't locked the door, if I hadn't stayed awake, everything could have changed." Damien returned that afternoon. His face darkened as I told him what had happened. He listened in silence, his jaw clenched, eyes blazing not with fear but fury. Then, in a voice that was low and tight, he said, "Olivia, I swear this will not happen again. I didn't soften. Then what will you do? I asked, my voice trembling with something more than anger. You brought me and my daughter into your world, into your shadows. You say we're safe, but not even this house is safe anymore. What will you do to change that? He didn't answer immediately. He only clenched his fist and stepped closer. I know, he said at last, eyes locked on mine. And I will answer that question with actions, not promises. I didn't speak again, but that night, I returned to my place by the door, knife in hand, eyes on my daughter. I was no longer the woman left behind at the altar. I was a mother, and for the first time in my life, I understood what it meant to fight for what you love, not with strength, but with the will to face darkness without flinching, not by waiting to be saved, but by refusing to be broken. That dinner felt different from the moment Damien asked the staff to set the table in the smaller room near the library instead of the grand dining hall, where we usually ate. When I stepped inside, candles were already lit. Red wine had been poured into delicate crystal glasses, and only 2 plates were set. No Emily, no one else. Damien was standing, waiting. He wasn't wearing a suit, just a white dress shirt with the sleeves rolled up, his tie loosened, and his face still bore signs of fatigue, though somehow softer than usual. I walked in, still carrying the quiet edge of wariness after the long night we had endured, but also burdened with questions I had carried for too long. He nodded for me to take a seat, poured a little more wine into my glass, and then sat down across from me. No greeting, no apology, just a silence stretched taut between 2 people who both understood that something unspoken hung in the air between them. I was the first to break it. You knew what happened last night, didn't you? Damien stayed quiet for a few seconds, his eyes fixed on his glass. I suspected it might, but I didn't think they'd be bold enough to act on it. Then why didn't you strengthen the security? Why allow the alarm system to be bypassed? Why let me and my daughter sleep in a house that someone could enter? My voice wasn't raised, but every word sliced through the distance between us like a blade. Damien didn't deflect. I underestimated how desperate he had become, and I overestimated the fear he still held for me. But that mistake changes everything now. I stared at him for a long moment, then set my knife down. I need the truth, Damien. Not scattered fragments, not more promises of protection. I need to understand why Emily and I have become the center of this storm. He straightened his posture and drew in a deep breath, like a man preparing for a cross-examination. Brian owed me a great deal of money, but that debt alone wasn't enough to make me force you into marriage. He paused, his voice dipping lower. What you don't know is that Brian sold information about me, about my network, about the people closest to me. He didn't just betray me. He fed my enemies. I felt the blood drain from my face. He continued. I found out too late. The names he gave away were being watched. Some of them have vanished. I couldn't let him escape, and I couldn't let him use you again. I narrowed my eyes. So what was I to you? A pawn to keep him in check. A stand-in for a mistake you didn't want to pay for. Damien looked directly at me. At first, I chose you because you were the only person close to him I believed was innocent. I investigated you. Olivia, I know you're a single mother, that you've been hurt more than once, but you still stood up every time. You're not part of my world, but that's exactly why I wanted to keep you out of it. The room was so quiet I could hear the soft ticking of the clock on the wall. I turned away, unwilling to let him see the tears welling up in my eyes. I didn't know what hurt more, the fact that he had investigated me like some kind of case file, or the fact that he thought I was good and still pulled me into this dangerous life anyway. He poured more wine into my glass, this time gently, saying nothing. I whispered, more to myself than to him, I don't know if I can keep living like this. Always looking over my shoulder, always dreading the night. Damien leaned forward. I don't expect you to trust me, not yet, but let me show you this much. Not everyone who lives in the dark is trying to do harm. Some of us stay in the shadows so that others can live in the light. I looked at him, for a long time, and even though doubt still clung to my chest, I couldn't deny that the man sitting across from me no longer felt like the cold figure in a tailored suit I met on our wedding day. He was becoming someone else, someone slowly shedding the armor he had worn for too long, someone trying to speak the truth, even if it might shatter everything. And I, Olivia Harper, walked into that dinner determined to demand answers. But I left the table with more questions than before. The only difference was this time, I was no longer afraid of the truth. I was only afraid I wouldn't be strong enough to face everything waiting behind it. After that dinner, there was a strange quiet between Damien and me. It wasn't distance anymore, nor the smoldering tension that had once filled the space between us. It was the silence that settles between two people who have begun to see each other clearly but have no idea what to do with the truth that's been revealed. Damien's presence grew more tangible after that, not just during meals but in small, unexpected moments. Once, while I was teaching Emily to sound out words in the little study upstairs, I turned and saw him standing in the doorway. He didn't speak. He just watched calm, still with a look I hadn't seen before. Not the gaze of a man accustomed to power, but of someone who had missed too many chances to know what a family really feels like. He left without a word, though I could still feel the weight of his quiet long after he was gone. But his concern, however genuine, began to take a different shape. At first it felt like warmth, a kind of safety I hadn't known in years. Then slowly, it began to tighten, like a cloak drawn too close. I realized I could no longer leave the property without someone accompanying me. My phone was replaced, again, this time with software that allowed only a few pre-approved numbers. When I asked Mrs. Gran about it, she simply said it was a new directive for our safety. Yet every phone call I made carried a hollow echo on the other end, as if someone were quietly listening. Once, I tried to call Molly, my oldest friend back in Charleston. The call cut off midway. When I asked Damien why, he answered with only one line. "She isn't safe, and I won't let you contact anyone who could lead them to you." I didn't argue then, but something inside me cracked. I understood his logic. I knew the danger was real. But there's a thin line between protection and control, and it's the kind of line people rarely notice until they've already crossed it. One afternoon, I decided to take Emily out to the garden without telling anyone. The air was soft, the light warm. We walked to the far end of the yard where the hedges met the outer fence. But before we reached it, a man from Damien's security team appeared. He didn't threaten us. He didn't raise his voice. But the look in his eyes chilled me. I asked why he was following us. He replied simply, "We have orders to make sure you don't go beyond the permitted area." I took Emily's hand, turning back toward the house. Her little palm was warm and trusting in mine, and that trust felt heavier than the fear pressing on my chest. That night, after I'd tucked her into bed, I waited for Damien in the library. When he finally entered, I didn't circle around my words. "Are you protecting me or keeping me prisoner?" He didn't flinch. He sat across from me, his gaze steady, unreadable. "Olivia," he said quietly, "I know you feel confined, but believe me, if I don't do this, what happened that night will only be the beginning." "I can't live like a ghost in this house, Damien," I said. "I want to walk outside. I want to call the people I love. I want to choose my own life." His hands clenched, the effort of restraint visible in every line of his face. "I've lost someone before," he said at last, his voice low and rough. "Someone who believed they could protect themselves out there. They never came back. I won't let that happen again." For the first time, I saw fear in his eyes. Not the kind that intimidates, but the kind that consumes, the kind of fear so strong it makes a man willing to cage what he loves just to keep it safe. I understood his fear. But I also knew that care cannot become an excuse to take away someone's right to choose. I stood up without another word and walked out of the library. And in that quiet, echoing hallway, I understood something more deeply than I ever had before. If there was love between us, and I still wasn't sure there was, it could not survive if it was built on fear. I didn't yet know what I would do next, but I knew one thing with absolute clarity. If I didn't speak now, his protection would harden into chains. And I could not let Emily grow up in a world where freedom was disguised as affection. Not again. Not another mother mistaking silence for love. 3 days after that tense conversation in the library, Damien called me into his study on a morning thick with fog, the kind that blurs even the outlines of the trees beyond the windows. The room still smelled faintly of aged leather and polished wood, the air heavy with a silence that felt almost sacred. Light filtered in through the gauzy curtains, soft and hesitant, as if time itself was unsure how to move forward. He wasn't standing behind his desk, as he usually did. Instead, he stood by the window, hands in his pockets, his gaze fixed on the forest behind the estate. When I entered, he didn't turn right away, and in that long moment of stillness, I knew he was about to say something he had rehearsed more times than he'd admit. "Olivia," he began, his voice low and rough, like something worn from use. "I've been thinking. About everything. About you. About Emily. About the choice I forced you to make when all of this barely began." I said nothing. I didn't need to. He turned to face me then, and for the first time, his eyes held something fragile, something real. "You don't belong here," he said quietly. "And I shouldn't keep you here under the pretense of safety, if that safety costs you your sense of self." I didn't understand immediately. Then he continued, I'm giving you a choice. You can leave. Take Emily. I'll arrange everything. Housing, money, temporary security. You can start over. I won't stop you." The words dropped like stone into water, heavy and slow, rippling outward in ways neither of us could fully predict. Part of me felt a strange release, a weight loosening in my chest. But beneath the stillness, a quiet anger stirred. "You think I've been looking for a way to escape?" I asked, my voice measured, calm. "No," he said quickly. "I just don't want to keep you here if staying makes you feel trapped." I looked him in the eye. "Damien, you pulled me into your life. You chose to keep me here. You placed Emily at the center of a world I never asked to enter. And now, just when I'm starting to ask questions, when I'm beginning to understand the shape of this life, you open the door and ask me to walk away. You think that's noble?" I wasn't angry because he was offering me a way out. I was angry because he thought that offering was protection, because he believed letting me leave meant he had done the right thing. "I'm not the kind of woman who runs the moment things get complicated," I said. "I've lived through enough to know that walking away doesn't always solve anything, that sometimes staying takes more courage than leaving." He stepped closer, the weight of his gaze more intense than ever. "I'm not afraid of complicated, Olivia. I'm afraid you'll regret staying." "I don't regret being here," I said, "but I do fear losing myself in the silence. I need to know. I need to choose. I need to be part of this life, truly part of it. If you want me to stay," he nodded slowly, "then tell me what you need. I need the truth, not just the pieces you choose to share. I need to know what lies ahead, not just when the danger knocks on our door. I need to know when you're afraid, when you're uncertain, when you don't have all the answers. I can't live next to a ghost of a man who never falters. I need someone human." He exhaled a long, tired breath, like he'd been holding it for years. "I've lost too much to allow myself to be vulnerable." "I know," I said. "But if you keep me at the edge of your emotions, no amount of security will make me feel like I belong. I'll always be on the outside, looking in." He said nothing. We stood there, two people surrounded by the soft gray light of morning, no longer angry, just full of everything unspoken. And in that moment, I understood that what he had done was the hardest thing for him to offer me a choice. But it was also the wrong choice, because I didn't need a door opened so I could leave. I needed a door opened so I could step inside his world, fully, truthfully, into all the shadows and stories he had never let anyone see. And that was what he still wasn't ready to give. It wasn't that I couldn't walk away. It was that he didn't yet believe I would stay if he let me see everything. And somehow, that hurt more than any goodbye ever could. That night, I didn't sleep in my own room. After the conversation with Damien, I needed space to breathe, to be somewhere the sound of footsteps in the hall didn't echo like questions left unanswered, to be away from walls that seemed to whisper everything I wasn't ready to hear. I chose the guest room on the 3rd floor, a quiet space, long forgotten by the rhythm of the house, where silence felt less like loneliness and more like stillness. I closed the door, not locking it, but not expecting anyone to knock either. But when the clock struck midnight, there was a soft knock, then the faint sound of someone testing the handle. I didn't speak. I didn't move. I knew it was Damien. He said nothing, didn't try again. He just stood there for a while. And then his footsteps faded down the hall, slow and heavy. The door between us remained closed. Not just the wooden one, but all the doors of words not spoken, of feelings unnamed, of the uncharted distance between two people who seemed so close, yet still lived in entirely separate worlds. I wondered how many doors like that had existed in his life. How many he had locked to protect himself, to keep the outside world from entering the darker parts of who he was. And how many people before me had stood outside, knocking quietly, waiting for him to let them in only to leave when they realized he never would. I didn't want to be one of them. But I also couldn't stay outside forever, hoping the door might someday open itself. The next morning, I took Emily out for a walk earlier than usual. The air was cold, the grass still wet with dew, and the trees held a hush that only morning could carry. Emily held my hand, telling stories about a brown squirrel that liked to sit outside her window. I smiled and nodded, but my heart felt heavy. When we returned, Damien was standing at the front steps, hands in his pockets, his eyes meeting mine but making no move to come closer. Emily ran up to him, beaming. "Uncle Damien, Mommy gave me breakfast early today." He crouched and gently tousled her hair. "Good. Kids shouldn't be hungry." It was such a simple thing to say, yet it caught something in my chest and held it there. When I walked past him, the space between us was cold and thick. He didn't stop me. I didn't say anything. There was nothing polite left to say. That afternoon, I found a letter left in my room, his handwriting slanted and strong, not decorative, but unmistakably his. In it, he said there were things he didn't know how to say aloud, that he wasn't afraid of the truth, but of what it might do to me if I saw all of him, that the door between us was never locked only. He hadn't yet learned how to open it. I folded the letter slowly, sitting in stillness for a long time. Out of all the things he'd said to me, this was the most honest. Not because it was eloquent, but because it was clumsy. And clumsiness, I've learned, is often the shape that truth takes when someone isn't used to letting others in. But I didn't respond. Not with a letter. Not with words. I let the day pass as if I hadn't read it. I needed to know if he would come to that door, or if he'd turn away like he always had. On the third day, while I was reading in the library, Damien walked in. No warning, no guarded posture. He sat across from me. No phone, no paper, no armor. Just one question. Will you teach me how to say the things other people say every day? I closed the book, met his eyes. The first thing you need to learn, I said, is to stop calling your feelings by other names. If you're scared, say you're scared. If you need something, say you need it. Don't turn it into strategy or safety. He nodded, quiet. Then I'm scared of losing you, and I need you. For the first time, I didn't see the powerful man who made others bow. I saw someone sitting on the edge of himself, waiting not for control, but for connection. Someone who didn't want to fall alone anymore. I didn't answer. I stood, walked to the door, but instead of leaving, I gently pushed it open wider, then looked back at him. Sometimes, you don't need to walk through a door to make a promise. Sometimes, just leaving it open is enough to say, I'm still here. Damien understood. He didn't follow, but there was something in his eyes, something uncoiled, something surrendered. And I knew then, the door between us was no longer a wall. It was a vow. That someday, we wouldn't be standing on either side. We'd be walking through it together, slowly, but together. From that day forward, nothing changed dramatically on the surface, but everything was different in a way only those inside the moment could feel. Damien began inviting me to sit in on smaller meetings held in the mansion. Not the high-stakes strategy sessions or tense negotiations, but brief encounters with his people. Moments where I could simply listen, and he didn't hide things. He explained the terms I didn't understand, the tangled relationships between powerful groups, the tightrope he walked between the laws of the outside world and the laws of the one he helped rule. He no longer hid me behind thick doors. He brought me into the light not by force, but by invitation. And yet, the closer I stepped into his world, the more I understood that if I didn't draw boundaries, I would be swept away. One evening, after Emily had fallen asleep early, exhausted from a day full of play, I walked into Damien's office. He was hunched over a stack of papers, focused so intently he didn't notice me at first. I spoke gently. If I choose to stay, I said, then I won't stay just to be kept safe. I won't disappear like the other women who might have passed through your life if there were any. He looked up at me, silent, waiting. I need rules, I continued. Lines you don't cross, no matter the excuse. No monitoring my phone, no restricting mine or Emily's freedom unless there's a real, immediate threat. And most importantly, I won't carry the burden of your past mistakes. Damien nodded slightly, though his expression remained unreadable. He didn't resist, but he didn't agree outright either. You can be part of my world, Olivia, he said after a pause. But you need to understand everything in this world has a price. If you make rules, you must also be prepared for the moments when the rules bend to survive. I'm not trying to control you, I told him. I just need to know who I am in all this. I won't be a debt, or a disguise, or a shadow you use to cover something you lost. He stood, walked to the window, staring out into the dusk-soaked courtyard, then turned back to face me. His voice was lower now, slower. You are the first choice I've made that wasn't part of a strategy. The first decision I didn't make with a backup plan in place. He stepped toward me, close enough for his words to land where they were meant. And that's why you're the most dangerous thing in my life. Because if you walk away, I wouldn't know how to replace you. My heart paused, not out of fear, but recognition. What he said wasn't a confession of love, it was a confession of vulnerability from a man who'd lived his life behind numbers, power, and control, and now faced something he couldn't calculate. I didn't answer him right away. Instead, I walked over to the desk and placed a small notebook down. Inside were pages of my observations around the house, the daily rhythms of the staff, the quiet habits I'd noticed, the small things Damien might have missed. He looked at the notebook, then up at me. I want to be involved, I said. but in my own way. I don't want to be just the woman you protect. I want to know. I want to understand. And if I have to, I'll fight to keep things from slipping out of control." Damien opened the notebook, flipped through a few pages, his eyes lighting up with surprise and something close to respect. Then he nodded. "Then from now on we play by your rules too. But remember, rules only matter if you're willing to protect them." I smiled quietly, but with resolve. "I've spent my whole life protecting my daughter," I said. "I'm no longer afraid to protect myself." And in that moment, for the first time, I didn't feel like a guest in Damien's life. I was a part of it not because he allowed it, but because I claimed my place. His world was still dangerous, still tangled in shadows and truths I didn't fully understand. But in that world, I had found solid ground. And I never thought I'd earn that, not through tears, but through boundaries, and the courage to walk into places others only dared to watch from afar. Since that conversation, there were no more promises between Damien and me, no more fragile boundaries pretending to hold weight. What grew between us was quieter, more certain, a silence that understood itself, a contract unwritten but binding in ways no paper ever could be. He never asked again if I was sure about my choice, and I never needed his reassurance that I belonged. We began to move like two gears, finally locking into place after countless slips. Things didn't get easier, not in any grand way, but each step forward was met with acknowledgement, even if the dialogue came only through a glance. Damien started bringing me into more meetings, not just to observe, but to witness. He didn't always seek my opinion, but when I gave it, he listened, and more importantly, he remembered. I learned to see the men around him not just as bodyguards or allies, but as pieces of a system I had never imagined existed. I wrote everything down, each meeting, each phone call, each hushed conversation that drifted through the hallway at dusk, went into a small notebook I carried with me everywhere. Damien never asked me to do it, but when he once caught me reviewing my notes, he simply said quietly, "You have an outsider's eye, none of us can afford to keep that anymore. Don't lose it." One morning, I noticed a gap in the estate's security rotation. I brought it to him without accusation, just fact. He didn't argue, didn't dismiss it. He summoned the team, corrected the issue, and afterward turned to me, head tilted, and said, "Maybe I should start earning your trust by showing I trust you." I laughed, a genuine laugh. The first in weeks that didn't feel like a defense mechanism. What we had wasn't the wild burn of two people falling blindly into love. It was steadier than that, like rowing a small boat together across deep water. Every wave forced us to move in unison or risk capsizing, and slowly, through the quiet of early mornings and the stillness of long nights, we built a rhythm, an unspoken alignment. There were no titles between us. We weren't lovers, not in the traditional sense, not husband and wife. But I knew that when I passed him in the hallway, and he turned just to watch me walk away, there was something deeper than any name could capture. It was recognition, respect, a kind of affection that didn't depend on grand gestures, but on standing next to each other in silence and still feeling safe. Emily had begun to settle into the rhythm of Damien's presence too. She no longer hesitated around him. Sometimes she'd tug his hand to sit with her, telling stories about imaginary school days and squirrels in the trees outside her window. Damien listened awkwardly, clumsily, but his eyes softened in a way I had never seen them do for anyone else. One evening, just the two of us stood outside in the backyard. The night was cool. The wind stirred the trees gently. We didn't speak for a while. I didn't look at him when I asked, just kept my eyes on the stars. "Do you ever imagine a different life?" I said. His voice was low, thoughtful. "Yes, but in that life I always pictured myself alone." I smiled faintly. "I never did. I always imagined a life where I didn't have to be strong every second, where I could set something down and know someone else would carry it for a while." He nodded slowly. "Maybe it's time I try imagining that version instead." That sentence wasn't romantic. It wasn't even comforting, in the way we expect declarations to be. But it was the most beautiful confirmation I'd ever received. In his world, I existed now, not because I demanded a place, but because I had stood beside him long enough, quietly, until that place shaped itself. What we shared didn't need to be named. It wrote itself day by day in the things we did, in the choices we made, in the trust, slowly and deliberately exchanged, and in the silences, the sacred, solid silences that only people who are truly connected ever learn to value. That morning began like any other, but something in the air told me clearly and quietly that everything was about to change. Sunlight slanted through the dining room window, casting a golden shimmer across Emily's glass of milk. She laughed, trying to catch the light with her spoon as if she could hold it in her hands. I sat across from her, smiling, fingers tracing the worn cover of the notebook I always carried. The world around me no longer felt foreign. The wind weaving through the trees, the scent of morning coffee drifting from the kitchen, even the steady footsteps of the guards outside had all become familiar, like background notes in a melody I'd finally learned to hum. I once believed I wouldn't stay here long, that I was just a visitor passing through Damien's world. But now, with everything finally settling, I saw the truth for what it was. I had taken root here, more deeply than anyone else who had ever crossed the threshold of this house. After breakfast, I brought Emily to the little garden on the east side, where she loved to run between the lavender bushes and name every butterfly in her own little language. I sat on the stone bench I had come to claim as mine, opened my notebook, and began to write. But this time, it wasn't strategy or notes on Damien's people. It wasn't about caution. It was about memory. I wrote about the first day I arrived, how afraid I was, how lost. I wrote about the nights I nearly gave up, about the silence that had once felt like a threat and somehow turned into comfort. I wrote about Damien's eyes when he said he needed me. I wrote about Emily's laugh, the first real one I'd heard from her in a long, long time. At some point, tears fell onto the page, not from pain, but because I had finally come to believe something I had never dared to before, that I could choose to stay, not out of fear, not because I had no other option, but because I wanted to. That afternoon, Damien returned from a meeting with a partner in the outskirts. I waited for him in the upstairs hallway, where the light through the stained glass cast a warm golden patch on the floor. When he stepped in, still in his familiar gray suit, I walked up to him and said it softly, like a truth that didn't need to be shouted. "I'm not going anywhere." He stopped. His dark eyes found mine, surprised. He didn't ask why. He didn't ask what had changed. He just stood there, silent, as if even a single word might shatter the moment. I reached out and touched his hand. "I used to think this place wasn't meant for me. But here, I learned to trust again. Not just you, but myself." Damien nodded. He held my hand not tightly, but firmly enough that I felt the truth in it. We stood like that for a long time. No more words. No need to define what would come next. Because for someone who had once believed there was no place to call home, choosing to stay was the bravest act of all. And in that moment, in this house full of locked doors and half-healed memories, I knew I had stepped into a new chapter. No longer someone swept up by the tide of someone else's story, but someone who chose deliberately to stand still, to claim a home, to choose a man, and to love in her own way. The day I chose to stay was not the day everything became perfect, but it was the day I stopped running and began to truly live. One early spring morning, with the sun warm just enough and the air still carrying the faint chill of the night before, Emily and I stepped into the back garden, where the lavender bushes had begun to bloom. Damien was already there, seated on the wooden bench with a steaming cup of tea in hand. When he saw us approaching, there was a softness in his eyes I hadn't seen before, gentle, unguarded, like the quiet after a long storm. Emily ran to him, arms flung wide, bursting with excitement as she told him about her dream from the night before. She said she flew up into the sky and picked a star with her own hands. Damien bent down, held her close, and whispered that if there ever was a star meant for her, it was she herself, shining in his life and mine in ways no dream ever could. I stood a few steps away, watching them, my heart beating slowly and steadily with the kind of peace that doesn't come often in a lifetime. There were no more echoes of thunder from the past, no shadows slipping quietly down the hallway. This house, once built on secrets and power, had quietly become our home. Dinner that evening was simple but warm, the kind of meal that didn't need ceremony to feel special. Damien poured the wine, and when his eyes met mine across the table, I knew exactly what he wanted to say without a single word spoken, that this was sacred. I reached out, placed my hand over his, and in that small gesture, I carried all the gratitude for every time I had chosen not to walk away. I was no longer just a single mother trying to survive. I was part of a real family. Not a perfect one, not one that followed any script, but a family born from choice, built on trust, and held together by a quiet kind of love that didn't need to prove itself to the world. My story stands as proof that even if your past is full of cracks, even if the world feels cold and uncertain, if you are brave enough to believe again just once more, you will find where you truly belong. Maybe all of us, at some point in our lives, stand at a crossroads where the distance between leaving and staying is decided not by logic, but by something as fragile as the grip of a hand, the look in someone's eyes, or simply the peace that comes from calling a place home. If you've stayed with me until this final chapter, I want to ask you something. How did you feel listening to the journey of Olivia, Damien, and Emily? Have you ever faced a moment that asked you to choose between running away and stepping forward with courage? I invite you to share your honest thoughts in the comments. Your story might be the strength someone else needs, perhaps a single mother still trying to find her way, or someone standing at the edge of their own turning point. If this story meant something to you, I hope you'll consider subscribing to the Dear Single Mom channel, liking this video, and sharing it with someone who may need it. We are here to tell real stories that matter, stories that carry quiet strength and remind us all that trust and love can still exist in a world that sometimes forgets. Thank you for staying with us until the end. I wish you good health, a life of quiet joy, and moments each day that bring you peace. Farewell for now, and I'll see you again in the next video.